Thanks very much. And I don't think I got my little, well, this may be my clicker. So really an honor to be here with all of you. And please dig in. The food is fantastic. Enjoy it. And I want to thank certainly all of you for the kind introduction. Tony Coelho, who's just been someone I've admired and supported for many, many years. He was a key, important person in Congress when I started my career in Washington, D.C. And I want to thank my colleagues, Linda Lake, the head of our firm in D.C., Alicia Snell, Jonathan Voss, and Emily Caramelli, who really conducted this research. And as a team, we worked to analyze and share with you what we've learned. And as was noted, we're just dipping our toe in here. I think this is one of the first early looks at what this community is and its potential to be an incredibly important factor in American politics and in government. But I would say at the moment it's potential, right? We're talking about something that is out there, but it is not fully realized. And so I really want to impress upon you 4 things that we have learned from this very initial study, but exciting study, to actually look at who is the disability community and what potential power, what do they have to offer in terms of being a factor in American politics. So I want to impress upon you 4 things. 1, the size of this community, which is remarkable. It's not only the number of people that are disabled themselves, which is millions and millions of Americans, but also the community around disabled Americans, their family, their friends, their caregivers. The diversity of this population, which is striking and reflects obviously the increasing diversity of the country as a whole, but that diversity is a potential strength of disabled Americans when you look at them as potential actors in our politics. The concerns or priorities of this community and how important those are in potentially shaping the future of the country. And then again, the potential. I think what we're looking at here is a potentially powerful actor collectively in our politics, state, national, and local, the ability, the potential of these Americans to really change what our politics is about, what it focuses on, and what our priorities are, and of course better policies and better lives for all Americans is really remarkable. And there's an incredible amount of this potential that we see in these numbers, but there's so much to do to actually realize it. So I'll start with some very dry things about, if this isn't working, then maybe someone can flip this for me. Maybe I pointed at something else. Point it down. Yep, there we go. Excellent. A lot of numbers, a lot of stats here. The bottom line is we just did a big survey of disabled Americans, of all Americans, and it included a close look at the disabled community. And as we said, there are different concentric circles here that we're talking about. And you'll see in the handout that many of you have the various ways that we define that community, and you'll see it on your paper if those of you have it on your table. We have many overlapping categories of people that relate to this community. Together, they make up almost 2/3 of Americans. And again, these are overlapping categories, but you've got about 20% of American adults who themselves, again, as respondents to our survey, have disabilities. And if anything, we think we're undercounting there because, of course, there's some people with disabilities that are harder to reach with a survey. Nevertheless, we had 20% already in this study, which allowed us to break down and examine that group very closely. We also have about 1/3 of Americans who have a family member with disabilities, and about 1/3 that have a close friend with disabilities. Those are overlapping categories, of course. But together, those 3 groups, people with disabilities, those with family members or close friends, that represents what we describe as the disability community. And that is a majority of Americans. 57% of American adults that we surveyed fit into one of those categories. So just through sheer numbers, that's an incredibly, potentially very powerful group of people in our politics. And then when you add to that what we call the extended disability community, and that refers to, there's some additional research that we'll reference here. That refers to not only the people themselves, their family, their friends, but also those who are professionally involved, either as they work professionally on behalf of people with disabilities or they volunteer spend significant amount of time volunteering for people with disabilities. Then you're adding another 15% of professional workers, 21% who are volunteers, and you fold that in, again, overlapping with the disability community, and you're now talking about 64%, almost 2/3 of Americans. That is a group of people who collectively could change and shape the future of the country if it were to, act together, act politically, and that's part of what we're trying to figure out here is what are the possibilities for that to happen. So backing up slightly, let me just say that we're in addition to the new research I'm presenting to you, which was conducted in October of this year, just in the last few weeks, we're also building on some previous research that was done over the past 2 years, including some colleagues. Many of you know that the Pew Research Center does fantastic work. If you're looking for a good nonpartisan pollster to follow their data and figure out what happened in the election tomorrow, Pew is a good place to look. Greenberg Research that has tracked some of these questions for several years, and at Rutgers University, some important research there. So all of that is built into some of the data I'm showing you, just to give that full acknowledgement. And then just to note, just in terms of limitations, and to be, since we're at an academic conference here, and very exciting to be here at the birth of this important academic center, we should acknowledge the limitations of this type of research always. It can't always reach everybody that we try to reach with this research, primarily on the phone. And of course, particularly Americans with disabilities, there are people with certain disabilities that make it harder for them to participate, and we recognize that we probably have undercounted and underrepresented certain groups of Americans. Nevertheless, we tried to get as wide a swath and as complete a picture as we could in this very first piece of research. So we're talking about a disability community that includes a core of 20% of American adults who have disabilities, and then these larger concentric circles of the disability community, all of their family and friends, and then the people who are involved professionally with disabled Americans, representing almost 2/3. So some key findings, and these are, again, I'll show you pretty graphs in a minute, but I'll start with some simple words here. People with disabilities are themselves a significant voting bloc, and one of the things we have been encouraging, in fact, in our other political work, not just for this project, but across the board, is to encourage our political clients, those who are candidates themselves, but also those who are advocates trying to affect the policy process and the political process in this country, to acknowledge, keep track of, pay attention to disabled Americans as a constituency, just themselves representing 20% of the country and 19% of likely voters. Disabled Americans, in spite of the many barriers and other issues that potentially make it more difficult to participate fully in our political process, nevertheless are interested, as you'll see in these numbers, quite interested and engaged in our politics, desirous of wanting to have an influence, and in fact vote at nearly the same rate as other Americans, despite the limitations and disabilities and barriers that exist. They are a very diverse community, both politically and otherwise. Disabled Americans basically reflect the overall adult population in terms of party identification, partisanship. We're about to have a very partisan election tomorrow, and you will find disabled Americans across that spectrum. It is true that you're more likely to have a disability as you get older, so one very noticeable characteristic of disabled Americans as a group demographically is that they're somewhat older on balance. Obviously, you have disabled people at all ages, but there are more of them in the older age categories. And because of that, you do find that likely voters with disabilities are actually slightly more Republican than voters overall, which is reflective of the fact that older voters are also somewhat more Republican than voters overall. And that the disability community as a whole, again, when we're adding in the friends and family of those with disabilities, make up 57% of the population. And when you look at this community and the potential that it has as a political force, they are not only engaged in a whole series of issues, which I'll show you what those priorities are, but they're more intensely engaged. They offer a greater level of interest, actually, when you compare the disability community to the non-disability community, people who are not in this circle of either the disabled or those in their friends and family. They're actually more interested in the most important issues and more likely to pay attention to those issues and to wish to vote on those issues, and I'll show you those numbers as well. And then finally, in terms of the actual content of what those concerns are, the number one issue, and this is the number one issue across the country in today and in the election tomorrow is healthcare. There are also a series of other issues which I'll show you that are of great concern to the disability community, but it is particularly true for disabled Americans and for the broader disability community that healthcare is a key priority. It makes sense, obviously, when you look at the needs that disabled Americans have in terms of health. But it's worth noting that as we talk about the ability of this community, which again is a majority of Americans, to actually help set the agenda for the country, that it will put healthcare front and center and potentially result in different outcomes in terms of policy. So this is a big table. I won't go through all the numbers here. It's just to note that, like the country as a whole, the disabled community is extremely diverse. And the 4 columns here are the total on the left. That's all adults, all American adults, obviously divided by gender. You see an age distribution, a racial distribution, regional, and so on. And then you get to the next column, which is people with disabilities themselves. Again, a large but substantial minority of Americans who have disabilities. This group is relatively older. About 63% of American adults with disabilities are over the age of 50, as compared to about 47% of all adults. They're distributed across the country. They're slightly more likely to be African American, but overall they have a similar, obviously a diverse racial distribution. They're slightly more likely to live in the South relative to the rest of the country. They're significantly less educated in terms of having a college education. So about 61% of American adults have no college education, do not have a 4-year college degree. Among people with disabilities, it's about 76%. And again, reflecting historical barriers and existing barriers to education. And connected, of course, to that is the fact that people with disabilities are also likely to have lower incomes. 41% of them have personal income under $30,000 a year. That's twice as many as you would find in the general population. They're more likely to be renters, all those things associated with somewhat lower education levels, lower incomes, and somewhat older, but otherwise very diverse and similar to the country as a whole. Then when you go more broadly, the 3rd and 4th columns here, the disability community, which again includes the friends and family, that begins to look more or less like the rest of the country. It is still a little bit older, a little bit more in the South, a little bit lower education levels, but by and large starts to look like the country as a whole. And then you go even further out and include the extended community, the extended disability community, including those who are involved professionally. You're really looking at a demographic picture that's very similar to the country as a whole. And all of that is just to say that they are America. They reflect what our country is, the increasing diversity of our country, and the wide spectrum of viewpoints, of course, that we have on politics. These are some of those key comparisons that I just mentioned in the longer table. Just for clarity, you see people with disabilities a little bit less, again, because they're somewhat older, less likely to have children at home, although 21% do have children at home. You have lower household incomes in general, under $30,000. 40% of them have incomes under $30,000. Less likely to have a college degree, more likely to be renters rather than homeowners. So that's who they are. What then do we find in terms of them as voters? Sorry, this is one more. This is just a breakdown again of those groups. And you see these are overlapping categories. So depending on who you're talking about, and this is really important, I think, when you're, as pollsters, we like to be very precise in terms of who are we targeting, who are we talking to? We're working for a lot of candidates who have elections tomorrow. And one of the things we do is try to advise them, let's be very, very clear on exactly who it is we're trying to communicate with, which voters we're trying to move, so we don't waste our resources. And when you're talking about the disability community, being precise is important. So are we talking about the 20% of Americans who have disabilities? Are we talking about the 34% who have a family member with a disability? Are we talking about the entire extended disability community, which all of these overlapping categories in the blue bars add up, as we said, to 64%, leaving that additional 36%, about a third of the country, who is not connected to the disability community. They don't have a friend, family member, they're not professionally involved, and that's a minority. The majority is the disability community when you extend it out that far. So, what do we know about them as an electorate? When we think about disabled Americans and the extended community as potential actors in our political process, people who can actually affect change in what is still a democratic country. Everyone please vote till we keep it that way. we see, first of all, again, the political diversity. So if you look at the people who are, this is a tracking, one of the things we do, of course, as pollsters is we track, what's the movement up or down, tracking that very closely as we get close to the election. And in this case, with a midterm election coming up, we're very interested, obviously, in the generic ballot. What's the difference between the two major parties in terms of how people are likely to vote for Congress? And you'll note, and this is tracking our own data along with the data from those other research partners that I mentioned, you'll see some ups and downs in this generic ballot. And this last number you see on these two graphs reflects our poll that we did for this project, which was just 4 weeks ago now. Obviously, there's been some additional movement nationally in the polls. But overall, we saw, and this is among likely voters, this is not everyone, this is people who said, I am likely to vote in this election. Among those who are not in the disability community, the current generic ballot is +6 Democratic, 6 points more voting for Democrats than Republicans. Among the disability community, we see a slightly more Democratic behavior, which is 10 points in favor of the Democrats. That's on the far right. What's interesting is that from January of 2018, which was a little bit of a peak, we saw some of the biggest gaps in people voting Democratic right at the beginning of this year after the passage of the Republican tax bill and some bad things they were doing on health care. I will try not to insert my own partisanship too much here, but there was, at that moment, a particular confluence of things people were upset about, and we saw a pretty big gap in the generic ballot then. Both disabled and non-disabled Americans, the community and the non-community, were about 11 or 12 points Democratic. There's been a little bit of slippage back to the mean. The most recent, even more recent than these numbers, most recent poll I saw from a good, legitimate pollster over the weekend was NBC Wall Street Journal, +7. Looks like the most likely generic ballot right now, assuming everyone's making the right assumptions about turnout. So if it's +7 points, these numbers also averaged out to about +7 about a month ago. That is a slight decrease in the Democratic advantage since the beginning of the year, but it is still a Democratic advantage. And notably among the disability community, which people rarely look at in politics, but we want them to do so more, you did not see the slippage. The disability community remained at that higher margin in favor of Democrats, whereas the non-disabled community actually was where you saw the movement a little bit back to the mean, back toward the Republicans. And this is how that breaks down. This is now among all adults, so that's a slightly different set of numbers than what you just looked at among likely voters. But if you look at all adults, we see that it was about +7 in the survey that we did of all adults in early October. Among people with disabilities, it was +7. The disability community more broadly, +9. The extended community, +8. And in the remainder, the non-disability community, +6. So these are minor variations, but again, if we begin to pay closer attention to this group of Americans as a potential interest in our, powerful interest in our politics, you could begin to see people target and actually move these numbers more effectively if, in fact, they were speaking to this community, which, frankly, we don't see most political leaders doing at this point. This is how we break it down in terms of party identification. Now we're back to likely voters. And again, it's worth noting that the voters with disabilities, so that what you saw before was how people intend to vote in this election. What we're showing you here are the underlying party ID. Now, this is a very partisan election. People are quite polarized. Most people are voting along with their party ID. But if you look at the independent voters, which is the fastest growing group among all Americans and among the disability community, they are leaning and breaking toward the Democrats in this election. And thus, you see, even though the party ID here, so among all likely voters, party ID is about +6. Among the voters with disabilities is actually closer to even. Now remember, people with disabilities are older. On balance, those tend to have a more Republican party ID. So the underlying party ID among people with disabilities is actually dead even between Democrats and Republicans. But if you get to the likely voters in the disability community, it moves up again to +10. And what you're seeing there is the increased enthusiasm among Democrats relative to Republicans in this election, and you're seeing the break of independence toward the Democrats. And we're seeing that within the disability community as much as we're seeing it, in fact, a little bit more in the disability community, that break, than you're seeing it among those who are not in the community. And this is, so if you look at the shift in that, as we noted, there was a shift in a shift back to the mean among those who are not in the disability community, that's on the left, from plus 12 down to plus 6, still an advantage for Democrats. Among people with disabilities down to exactly 0, and then among the extended disability community back to a plus 7. So we're seeing some movement in both directions when we look at disabled Americans. And that's partly a reflection of whether they're paying attention. So I'm going to step back and give you some numbers from 2 years ago and then talk about what the implications are for this year. 2 years ago, Pew, which again does some of the best national studies on this, found that disabled Americans were paying more attention to the election than other Americans. So they were, to their credit, actually measuring this, which a lot of the national pollsters don't do, and they found that if you had a disability, you were more likely to have thought a lot about the election, more likely to be following the campaign, and more likely to say that it really matters who won the election. And the most attentive voters always are seniors. People over the age of 65 are more attentive than younger voters. That's always been true in every poll that's ever been done. And if you look at whether someone has a disability or not, if they're a senior, they were even more likely, if they're a senior, to pay close attention, although the numbers were pretty close. That's the middle bars there. Then on the bottom, you see people under 65, and again, you see, although in general, people under 65 were paying less attention, and we did see lower turnout among young voters in 2016. It's one of the reasons we got the outcome we did. You nevertheless see that within the group under 65, those who are in the disability, those who are themselves disabled Americans were more likely to be paying closer attention to the election than those who are not. So if disabled Americans are paying closer attention, does that mean they actually have outsized political influence? No. And that's really for two reasons. One, it's not a community that is fully organized in politics, right? It hasn't been developed as an interest group that can actually, the structures are not as strong or in place as you have for other interest groups in our society, but the potential is there given those numbers. And then secondarily, of course, it is actually harder to vote. It is harder to participate if you're disabled for many, many reasons, and the center here, of course, is studying those. So in fact, even though there was higher interest, greater interest among disabled Americans, the Rutgers study found in 2016 that the turnout was actually lower. So if people, among all adults, we got about 61% turnout, which was fairly weak, fairly low for a presidential election nationwide. Among people with disabilities, it was 56%. So even though they were more interested, more concerned than voters overall, they actually turned out at a lower rate. And 44% said they did not vote, reported not voting in 2016. And if you look at the reason for not voting, the most common reason for not voting among everybody is, I didn't have time or I wasn't interested. That's true for people with disabilities as well, but 20% of them said, my illness or disability made voting too difficult, right? And that reflects, circumstances in their own lives, but of course barriers that exist in our system as well. So the numbers and the level of interest and concern represent an incredible potential, again, in this community. The actual ability to participate is still somewhat lower because of these barriers. Then when we look, so quickly let me run through, because I know we want to get to questions. We have, again, levels of interest. This is now, we're back to 2018. So that was all our study from 2 years ago. Coming back to 2018 today, how interested are you? And what's interesting here is that while people with disabilities were more interested than other voters 2 years ago, now we're seeing actually pretty similar levels. And in fact, people with disabilities slightly lower in our most recent measure. And what that reflects is not that people with disabilities are less interested. What it reflects is that people without disabilities are more interested now than they were 2 years ago. There's been an overall increase, and we've seen more of that increase among people without disabilities, but very high levels of interest across the board. People are very, very interested in this election, and it looks like we're going to have record turnout for an off-year midterm election. Notably, that people with disabilities, 74% say they're interested in voting in the elections, 56% very interested. Among all adults, it's 76% are interested, 61% very interested. So slightly lower, interestingly, than overall, but still high levels of interest across the board. And if you look at likely voters, the bottom three bars, people who we already know are likely to vote, overwhelmingly, they're extremely interested in this election. Others have found this too. This is from earlier in the year, Greenberg research, finding a higher level of interest in voting among people with disabilities. We found also, this is an election that is, what's on the ballot is the Congress, of course, and people voting in these midterm races, but who's president is driving people's concerns, and we found, in fact, that people with disabilities, like the country as a whole, had rather negative views of President Trump. That is driving some of the interest in the election. That was true in particular. This is back in January, a net -17 approval rating for Trump. That was lower than his overall approval, which was -10 at that time. And again, at that time, the people with disabilities were somewhat lower in their views of the Republican Party. This has converged a little bit. Now they're more similar to the rest of the country, but nevertheless, you see people with disabilities reflecting the movement across the country in terms of being overall negative towards Trump and wanting their vote to be a message more opposing him than supporting him. And let me turn lastly to what those issues are, because in fact, people are not just sending a message about who they want their leaders to be, they're sending their message about their priorities and what they would like the election, what they would like their policymakers to focus on. These are the most important issues for Americans in this election and for people with disabilities. The top issues 2 years ago, economy and jobs was number one. That has declined in the current numbers, which I'll show you in a second. Healthcare, terrorism, and national security. That was 2 years ago. Many of those voting on the economy and jobs and on national security voted Republican. Many of those voting on healthcare voted Democratic. Since that time, most voters and most people with disabilities have not heard anything positive from the Trump administration about their issues. And they mostly think that things are going on the wrong track in the country. Those red bars represent people thinking that the country is going in the wrong track. This has not moved, even though you have, even people who are voting Republican mostly are divided on whether the country is going in the right direction. Those who are voting Democratic overwhelmingly think it's going in the wrong direction. That's true among people with disabilities. They oppose the Republican tax cut. These are all things that are driving people in a direction of wanting to vote for change and wanting to vote against those who are currently in office and currently in power. And these are the issues that are driving that vote today. So this is, from top to bottom, the most important. All of these are important issues. You see 95% saying they're at least somewhat important. So there's a wide range of concerns that are widely shared. In all of these cases, you're seeing a difference in importance between the top bar, which is the disability community, people with disabilities, and then underneath that, all adults. So I'm now back to the narrower group of people with disabilities themselves. First of all, it's pretty much the same range of issues. There's not a huge amount of difference here, but the intensity of interest, as we saw 2 years ago, the intensity and level of concern about these issues is greater among people with disabilities. There is, again, that potential for this to be a more active, a more engaged part of the population than voters as a whole, if it were not, again, for the structural barriers and other things that are reducing, making it harder for them to participate. They are 10 points more concerned about Social Security, 4 points more concerned about health care, 11 points more concerned about Medicare, 4 points more concerned about education. These are the priorities of the disability community, of people with disabilities, and they are, to some degree, setting the agenda. We are, in fact, seeing these issues being discussed, debated. These are the issues that people are running on. Those who are challenging incumbents and trying to win this election tomorrow are running on these issues. And it becomes a question of, do they understand, do they see people with disabilities, the disability community, as a constituency that they need to speak to? And that, I think, is a question that we're putting on the table. We don't have the answer to it yet because I think, honestly, they're not. For the most part, those candidates, those political leaders are not thinking of this as a constituency that they need to speak to. But as they begin to recognize the potential, the power that these numbers represent, they will be speaking to these issues. It's the same set of issues: healthcare, education, Social Security, Medicare, the economy and jobs. And if you look across the board here, you see the shaded numbers there, the blue numbers. Those are the likely voters in the disability community and with disabilities. Same top priorities, but even stronger for them: healthcare, Social Security, Medicare. They are older, but they're also recognizing the importance of these issues in terms of their quality of life, in terms of the quality of life of their communities, in terms of the future of the country. And if, in fact, we can move to a place where our politics begins to reflect the reality of the power, the reality of the potential, and the voting power that these voters have, people themselves with disabilities, their families and friends, those who are involved in working with people with disabilities. That's a majority of the country. And if, in fact, those who are running for office, those who are in office, begin to recognize what these numbers mean power, potentially. If, in fact, they're recognized, if, in fact, they're put on the table, and that voice is present, if it has a seat at the table in our politics, in our policy-making discussions, you will see these numbers reflected in actual changes in policy. And of course, those changes in policy are part of what this is all about. Understanding what the research tells us about this community, what the potential is for this community to act in our politics, and what the results will be. I think you will find, as a result of the work at this center and the continued research that we and others are going to do, that is going to result in a change in our politics, and perhaps even as soon as 2 years from now, when we have another presidential election and a whole set of primaries, California primaries coming up, March of 2020, not too soon, to be starting to get involved in setting the agenda for that primary. They may decide, this state may decide in March of 2020 who our next president is. And the work you're doing here, putting those issues of disability rights front and center, putting the issues that are of most importance to the disability community front and center, could actually set that agenda. So I'll stop there. That's what we have in terms of research. I want to thank you, and thanks everybody for your attention. Happy to take questions.